A question in relation to what's happening on the political front in Afghanistan at the moment. It's the mantra that's repeated always when soldiers are asked to explain what they're doing there. They say, we're supporting the civilian government. Given what's gone on in the election, do you think that President Karzai deserves that support?
It's certainly challenging in my view that the legitimacy of the current regime, particularly on the back of the elections, is very difficult, because I'm sure everyone's read, not recently, about the difference of opinion between the UN Electoral Complaints Commission about the legitimacy of the election process and also what the IEC is saying in Afghanistan as well. And quite rightly, people are questioning the legitimacy of the Kabul government. But it's what we've got, and I think it is still an improvement, and it's a really caveated term, than certainly what the Taliban were offering in terms of their government from 1996 to 2001. And it's a very immature democracy, and there are lots of problems with it. The key thing is to try and nurture it along, to try and improve the governance. And I don't think it's enough to answer your question specifically to turn around and say, because we don't like the way the government is working at the moment, and there are lots of things wrong with it and lots of things that need to change, that the Afghans don't deserve our support. And whether it's Karzai or Abdullah, I still think it's vitally important that we have NATO troops and obviously British troops in Afghanistan. Victory is going to fall somewhere short of a conventional victory in terms of armies surrendering and a clear political solution when one side has won and the other has lost. But if someone asks for, and I was reading something called the Briggs Plan, and this is when Briggs was sent out to Malaya in 1950, when that campaign was going badly wrong, and there were lots of similarities to what was happening in Malaya that are currently happening in Afghanistan. And you wouldn't go wrong to look at something like the Briggs Plan. I mean, the first thing is you need a sense of unified command and a single purpose, which is very difficult to do when you look at 1950, when it was the Malays and the British colonial administration trying to disengage from Malaya as it withdrew from empire. You don't have that in Afghanistan because it's 41, 42 nations and the Afghans themselves, vitally important. But you do need a greater sense of a common mission and purpose that everyone signs up to, and we can perhaps talk about that. You've got to focus on building up the Afghan security forces, both the police and the army, and that's going to require more troops. And while they take time to reach maturity, which is probably going to take years, you need more NATO troops to clear ground of the Taliban and then hold it for development. And development is absolutely essential because Afghanistan is both a physical and psychological conflict for the will of the people. And very sadly, the development aid, particularly the UK development aid under DFID, has been very poor. And there are other things you can add on to that: intelligence-driven operations, better use of accommodating, funny enough, which you in Malaya would have called SEPs, surrendered enemy personnel, bringing people who were former antagonists into the fold, because there has to be a cultural Pashtun solution which can't ignore the Taliban dynamic. And then I think finally, and this is probably the most crucial point, if we lose in Afghanistan, it will not be in the arid plains of Helmand province or in the foothills of the Hindu Kush. It will be in capitals like London and Washington. And it's vitally important that the domestic public arena in countries like the US and this country understand and support the mission in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, I don't think we have a publicized, joined-up strategy that makes sense to perhaps many people sitting here.
This is a strange there's a strange hybrid public reaction to the war. On one hand, there's great support for the armed forces, admiration for them, which goes hand in hand with deep misgivings about the purpose of the mission. Whose fault do you think it is that the message is not getting across?
Well, ultimately, it's got to lie at the door of our political leaders to stand up. I mean, it'd be an interesting sort of question to throw back to the audience of whether they think that UK PLC has the right priority to Afghanistan. I mean, it's not easy, and I can see the challenge for any politician, because for anyone to really stake their colours to Afghanistan takes a certain amount of personal career risk. And I detect there's a sense of Afghanistan being one of these beasts where people aren't sure which way it's going to go, and it's going to take a certain amount of courage to do that. But what we need to be clear about is there are 18-year-old British soldiers who are showing the right level of courage on a daily basis in Afghanistan. So perhaps people who come from a more privileged background need to take a leaf from their book and properly stake their colours to the mast of why we're in Afghanistan, the fact that it's going to be difficult and complex, but the fact that it's worthwhile doing. Take Musakala, for example, where we had some very difficult experiences there. I'd measure it by the level of violence and the level of fighting. I'd measure it by the number of children going to schools that have been built for them, market and economic activity, employment, how much local support there is for the Taliban. And I think if you secure an area properly, you would find, and admittedly over a reasonable amount of time, that people would turn away from supporting the Taliban if they felt that they were protected from their coercion. So there are a number of metrics where you could build a data argument, and it's about understanding the space of that. I mean, what you're not going to see, and certainly not in the short to medium term, is the sort of metrics that you might apply in a Western European society in terms of number of people voting, etc., etc. Because I think your average Afghan is less concerned about whether he's got the vote. It's whether he can deliver his produce to market, depending on what that is, whether that's opium or something else, that his children can be educated. Because whenever you sat down with a tribal elder and you said, you know, what are your ills in this village? And they used to mention health, particularly female health care, and very quickly after saying security, they would say education for our children. Because although the education and certainly the literacy rates in Afghanistan are very low, they are very conscious that their future is their youth and what they do. So I think, having said that, you can draw out certain parameters as long as you focus on areas. And then the key thing is that you begin to focus on one area, then perhaps another, and they then begin to join up. I don't think you can completely divorce the production of opium from somewhere like Helmand province. I mean, opium is a really easy crop to grow. Wheat isn't. Wheat, you need generators, you need fuel, you're more susceptible to the vagaries of the environment, etc. So I think just sort of turning around and saying, well, you should grow wheat. I mean, every time we went out into the poppy fields, there were other fields which were full of wheat. So I don't think it's enough to just say, well, they should grow wheat and not opium. The question is, what do you do about the opium? To stop people growing it, you have to make it economically worth their while. And if they are going to grow it, because it's a complex issue, because the production of opium is tied up with a sort of feudal debt bondage of farmers taking effectively loans to grow next year's crop. Sometimes that's legislated against their families as well. So just suddenly saying you can't grow opium has a huge impact, as apart from just not having the cash crop at the end of the day. But there are a number of things that could be considered, not least there is a world demand for opiates. So what is to say that we shouldn't buy some of that opium? It needs to be strictly controlled, and there probably needs to be a certain amount of carrot and stick in how that's managed. But you can play market forces as well. And that's something that I don't think has been explored in enough depth.